Hey, so a couple months ago, I came home from the office and pulled up to the house, and I went to the mailbox as I normally do. I opened the lid, reached my hand into the mailbox because I'm still like a kid and I'm excited about the bills that are coming in the mail, but they have my name on them, so it's like it feels great, right? So I reach in there, grab out the mail, and I look at one particular thing. It's a postcard. And in big, bold letters, it says jury duty. And two things came to my mind. The first was like, oh my gosh, Lord, I don't have time for this, right? The other thing secretly was like, man, this could be really cool, right? So there's like, oh God, Lord, I don't have time for this. There's no way that this is happening right now. And then the other side of me was like, all my favorite shows are, have something to do with a courtroom. I've always thought, man, it would be really cool to be an attorney. And so there's this like secret part of me, even as we're going through the whole process, where I'm like secretly kind of excited that I'm there. Everybody else is like, oh, and I'm like, this is kind of cool. And so I show up on my appointed day, and we go through this whole rigmarole of like all 6,800 of us, and they bring us into the courtroom, and there we sit, we get our seat, and I'm on the front row, so I can't like secretly be texting and emailing as I had hoped I would. Oh no, I'm right on the front row, right in the middle. Yes, I did get called out at one particular point. It's fine, it's all good. I was a great student, I was a good juror member for a very brief moment. And so the defense and the prosecutor get up there and they do their whole thing, right? Like they tell a little bit about who they are, a little bit about what's gonna happen, a little bit about the case. We learned that, hey, this is gonna be a first-degree felony case, right? So, hey, buckle your seatbelt. If you get chosen, you're gonna be here all week. So then I'm really like, oh my gosh, I don't have time for this. But again, I was still secretly like, man, this is kind of cool. So this whole process is going about, and one of the things that I learned in this process, which was pretty interesting, I should know this, but I hadn't really thought about it much until that particular day. But the defense got up there and he said, hey, listen, the prosecutor, bless their heart, they have a really big job to do. They have to prove to you beyond reasonable doubt that my client, the defendant, actually did what they're claiming that he did. So you got to prove beyond reasonable doubt, which is a pretty tall task, right? Pretty big, important thing to do. Now, the reason why I'm telling you all this is not because I want you to hear about my saga with the jury duty and all of those things. I was dismissed later on that afternoon, didn't get to experience the whole thing. It's fine. But the reason why I tell you all that is because today we're going to open up the Word and we're going to cover a whole lot of text this morning, but what we're looking at is Jesus on trial, okay? And in a sense, we're gonna get an invitation, so to speak, in the mailbox to show up for jury duty, right? We're gonna be there, we're gonna sit in the courtroom, and I want you to experience kind of the weight of what I would say is the most important, significant, historical trial that's ever been tried in all of history. And hear me, if you're not a Christian in the room, I think one thing that you and I can agree on is that whether you believe in God, whether you believe Jesus is a good teacher, or whatever it is that you think about Jesus, one thing that we can agree on is that this is the most influential trial that's ever happened in the history of the world. Here's the reason why I'm saying that. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about it. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about a trial that happened in the Middle East. I don't know of any other significant event except for a war or something that has been on the media that we're still talking about 2,000 years later. This is the most significant, life-altering trial that's ever happened, that thousands and thousands and thousands of lives have been changed because of this particular trial, okay? So we're gonna dive in. Now, keep in mind, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about Jesus preparing for what is to come, right? So he takes his friends into the Garden of Gethsemane, and there Jesus goes to the Lord in prayer, falls down on his face to prepare his heart for what is to come, which we know what is next, right? So Jesus prepares for all of the things that are gonna happen. Now, as they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, there is a mob of soldiers led by Jesus' own Judas that enter into the garden, and in Matthew chapter 26, Matthew records it like this. He says that they came up, they laid hands on Jesus, and they seized him. That simply means that they arrested him. They put him under arrest. And verse 56 says that all of the disciples left him and fled. So in that moment, Jesus is arrested. You might recall what Jesus told them before the garden, right? This is why he rebukes them for not being active in prayer and falling asleep in the garden. Why does he do that? Because he tells them, hey, listen, when all this happens, you guys are gonna leave me. Y'all are gonna bounce, right? And that is exactly what happens. As soon as Jesus is arrested, the disciples flee for their life. Now, from the garden, Jesus is going to stand trial before three particular groups of people, okay? This is really important. The first group of people is going to be the Jerusalem Council. That's made up of the high priest and his group of folks, right? That's the Jerusalem Council. Then Jesus is going to stand trial before the Roman government. You're going to see them stand trial before Pilate and also Herod, okay? That's important. And then thirdly, Jesus is going to stand trial before the crowds that have gathered together in Jerusalem for the celebration of the Passover. Because remember, we're situated right now, right in the middle of Passover. Passover is just about to happen. And so you have tons and tons of people all coming in to celebrate the Passover. And that is the crowd that Jesus will stand in front of. Okay, so three different groups of people. Now let's stop right there for a second. Let's ask the question, why has Jesus been arrested? So let's get some facts because I think that's important. What led to Jesus's arrest? Well, you have to keep in mind, just as soon as Jesus shows up, he begins his earthly ministry. You might remember that. John baptizes him. When John sees him, he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." From that moment, Jesus caused a scene. Right? Everywhere Jesus goes, he seems to cause a scene. And so from that particular moment, when he begins his ministry, he is on the radar of the religious leaders of his day. And really the reason being is because he just didn't fit into the box that they placed him in, right? He performed miracles that they had never seen before. He seemed to teach as one who had divine authority. Like he didn't just teach like another one of the religious teachers, but he taught with this unique authority. And yet he was a carpenter. They knew of him, right? Jesus wasn't somebody who just showed up and nobody knew who he was, right? They knew he was a carpenter. And yet here he is teaching with this divine authority. There were times in his teaching that he seemed to suggest that he was the Messiah, right? He would take them right to the edge of that moment and then he would bring them back off the edge. And that would infuriate them, right? This guy, he's claiming to be the Messiah. On top of all of that, you've got all these groups who are starting to follow Jesus. And they're believing that he really is the Jewish Messiah, which is so incredibly offensive to these folks. You can imagine their anger only grew as time went by, as Jesus had more and more followers. And so because they didn't understand Jesus, nor could they control him or his followers, right? They were left with one conclusion. It's the easy way out. You know what that is? We choose it all the time. We just got to get rid of the problem. Instead of dealing with the problem, moving closer to the problem, let's just get rid of it all. And so from that moment on, John chapter 11, they've decided, well, we just need to put an end to Jesus. He's just got to die. He's got to go. And so right after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, John observes chapter 11, verse 45. This is what John observes from this particular moment in history. He says that many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, they believed in him. So he's got a following. His following continues to grow. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. And so the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and they said, well, then what are we to do? If this guy, if his popularity continues to grow, then what are we to do? How do we handle this? And then somebody says, for this man performs many signs. Therefore, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. And so fearful of what they didn't understand and what might have come, here's their conclusion. Verse 53. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. I want you to keep this in mind because we're going to come back to this. They made plans to put Jesus to death. Okay, now here, keep in mind, as we build up to this moment, that Jesus is going to mount a donkey on Palm Sunday. By the way, today's Palm Sunday, look into Easter, right? So Palm Sunday, Jesus mounts a donkey and he enters into Jerusalem. This is his final descent into Jerusalem before he is going to go to the cross just a week later. He mounts this donkey and crowds gathered out together to greet him. And like a royal procession, they take off their robes, they lay it on the floor, and Jesus, like red carpet, rides into Jerusalem. Palm branches are waving in the air, and you can imagine that as he enters, people are celebrating his arrival. The Jewish leaders are only getting more and more and more angry. Keep in mind that as they do so, they're calling out, Hosanna, the Son of God, which means save us now. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest, right? This is what the crowds are calling. Matthew says that as Jesus comes into Jerusalem, the whole crowd was stirred up. Right? We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. It was as though an earthquake went off in Jerusalem. There was so much energy and anticipation as this man rides into Jerusalem. Now, as the Pharisees hear the roar of the crowd, John says that this is what they said to one another. Look, the world has gone after him. So Jesus rides into Jerusalem. John is observing the religious leaders of the day. He's observing the Pharisees and the scribes as they call out, look, the world has gone after him, which is a pretty dramatic phrase, right? We're just talking about Jerusalem here, right? There's a whole big world outside of Jerusalem. Yet here they are, right? The whole world has gone after them. And I think this phrase captures the dramatic moment of this time in history. To the Pharisees, it seemed as though the entire cosmos was celebrating the arrival of this man in whom they, by the way, believed to be a false prophet, to be a false Messiah. They did not buy the truth that Jesus was the capital M Messiah. He's not our Messiah. This is not the one that we've been waiting for. This is not the one that is to come, right? So in their mind, all of these people are gathering together to celebrate somebody who's a fake, a phony, right? So that's the weight of what we're talking about. Now, on top of that, here's what Jesus does. So Jesus rides into Jerusalem and he heads straight for the temple. And there in the temple, he begins to rebuke the Pharisees and the scribes, right? So he goes right at the leaders and he rebukes them for desecrating the temple. He cleanses the temple. He condemns these leaders, the very one who have desecrated the temple, and then he calls them some names. You might remember this if you've tracked this week of history. He calls them hypocrites. He says, you're blind guides, you're whitewashed tombs, and you are wicked servants. So these men who have built up this kind of idea that they're really, really, really important, significant people, Jesus is cutting their legs right out from under them, accusing them of desecrating the temple, being blind guides, whitewashed tombs, and wicked servants. And so you can imagine, you feel the anger boiling in these folks. I mean, you can't help but not. And so running out of time, they're feeling the weight of this moment. They're experiencing public embarrassment. And so they gather in a room to try to figure out, what are we going to do? How are we going to put an end to this guy? Because I can't take it anymore, right? So here they are, desperate to figure something out. They're in this room. They're probably gathered around a table. And all of a sudden, they hear a knock on the door. Knock, knock, knock. Somebody opens up the door, and guess who it is? Oh, our good old boy, Judas. Gotta love Judas, right? Judas is greeted by the Pharisees. He takes a step in chapter 26, verse 14, Matthew records this moment. He says, then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests, and here's what he said. Hey, what will you give me to deliver Jesus over to you? And we know the answer. They look back at Judas and say, we'll give you 30 pieces of silver to give up your man. And so Judas takes it. That sounds like a good bet. I'll take it. And so you can probably feel their relief, right? Up until this point, it's almost as like Jesus has them on trial. They try to go after him. And, if you're reading in the Gospels, you'll see very, very easily that Jesus just kind of slips out of their hands, right? It's like they never can arrest him. They never can seem to get him. On top of all of that, Jesus has a way of publicly humiliating them in front of everybody. And so now all of a sudden the tables have turned. In that moment, they're sitting at the table hearing Judas, and all they can see is a big W on the scoreboard. He's ours. It's over. We're going to get him, and we're going to get him a surprise attack at night. And so they gather up a group of folks, gather up some soldiers. They go get him, meet him in the Garden of Gethsemane. They arrest him, and they take him to stand trial before the chief priests. Now, as all of this is happening, the chief priests are working to gather witnesses against Jesus. Here's what Matthew writes in chapter 26, verse 15. He says, now the chief priests and the whole council, hear this is important, were seeking false testimony against Jesus. They were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. So they're trying to figure out some folks who can come and testify falsely so that they can carry out their plan to put him to death. Because remember, John 11, we've already put it to mind that we're going to kill this guy. He's done. He's over. So now they're looking for people to corroborate their story. But hear this is great. But they couldn't find anybody. They could not find anyone who would corroborate their story. However, many false witnesses did come forward, but not by their own doing, by somebody else's doing. We're going to cover that here in just a second. So as Jesus stands silently before them, two people come forward, and here's what they say. Oh, this man, this guy that's standing before you, this Jesus, this is what he said. I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. By the way, we know what he really said, right? In 3 days, he said, I will destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. What was Jesus talking about? He was talking about himself, him being the temple, the dwelling place of God. He says, I'm going to destroy myself, and in 3 days, I am going to rebuild it, right? He clarifies that. That's another point. Now, frustrated by Jesus' lack of response because he just stands there, right? He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't have an attorney who's standing right next to him to say, objection. He didn't have that. Jesus is all alone. He's standing before the council. And so Caiaphas, the high priest, here's what he says back to Jesus. He says, I adjure you by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Refusing again to answer his question, Jesus answers in this way. He says, you have said so. You've said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, capital P, power, and coming on the clouds of heaven. Filled with rage, Caiaphas, you can imagine he's so mad, he's so angry because he just can't get Jesus to do what he wants Jesus to do. He can't control him, right? And so he yells out at Jesus. He has yelled blasphemy, or he has uttered blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need to the council? And there, right then and there, the council decides Jesus' sentencing. He's deserving of death. He's deserving of death. Now, because of their anger and wanting to put an end to what we're going to call the Jesus movement, right? So Jesus' movement, gathering up all these people, they're worried about what's going to happen. They're wanting to put an end not only to Jesus, but silence all of the commotion, all of the stuff that they view is blasphemy. They view it as false testimony. They just want to put an end to this false prophet, right? And so they're wanting to put an end to this movement. And one, really the best way that they could do that is to have a public execution. Not only because that would put an end to the movement, but it's also retribution for them, right? Here's this guy that's been publicly humiliating us. We want to publicly humiliate him. And so instead of doing the dirty work, they punt all of that on Pilate. and the Roman government, right? And so knowing that Pilate's not going to care too much about blasphemy, because that's really what they've charged him with. At this point, they're charging him with blasphemy. And Pilate could care less about their religious issues, right? Pilate's cared about political status and keeping peace in Rome and all these different things. The last thing he cares about is what these religious leaders are experiencing in blasphemy, right? And so they know that. So here's what they do. They twist the story a little bit again. In chapter 23, verse 2 in the book of Luke, this is what they do. This is kind of how they turn the story. They begin to accuse Jesus, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." In other words, they are saying that Jesus is telling the entire nation of Israel and all of the people in the province of Rome not to pay taxes to Caesar. But again, we know what Jesus really said. What did Jesus really say? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. Right? That's what Jesus said, but they take a truth and they twist it to fit their agenda to put him to death. Now, here's the problem. They begin to sense that Pilate is not buying it. He's not buying the lie. And so here's what they do. Luke chapter 23, verse 5. They go on and they say, "But he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all of Judea, from Galilee even to this place." In other words, hey, he's not just a problem for me, he's a huge problem for you. He's creating an insurrection against Rome. Therefore, you need to put an end to this guy. It's not just our problem, it's your problem too. So I need you to act on the behalf of Rome, and I need you to kill him. All so that they don't have to do their own dirty work. And yet Pilate still sees no guilt in him. And so Pilate, he goes, you know what? I'll tell you what, here's what we'll do. He sends Jesus to Herod, right? So Jesus at this point has stood trial before Jerusalem council. They found him guilty in spite of no evidence, right? And now Jesus stands trial before Pilate. Pilate sees him as innocent. Pilate's like, man, I don't know what else to do here. I'm going to punt and I'm going to send him to Herod. So now Jesus stands before Herod. And then Herod is going to end up sending him back to Pilate. And this is what Luke says, chapter 23, verse 13 of this particular series of events. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and here's what Pilate said to them. "You brought me this man as one who has been misleading the people. Yet after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges that you have put against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." So you've got two of the most powerful men in the land who have an endless amount of resources, who have done their own investigation, and yet they cannot find any guilt in Jesus. As far as they're concerned, he's innocent. Now, fearing Pilate would do as he said, here's what the chief priests begin to do. They begin to lead out in a cry, "Crucify him, crucify him." And all of a sudden now Jesus, who's been on trial before the Jerusalem council, before the Roman government, now he is by proximity on trial in front of the crowds. And the crowds begin to yell out, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." In chapter 23 of verse 18 of Luke, this is what the crowds cry out together. "Away with this man and release to us Barabbas." Crucify him, give us Barabbas is what they're saying. A man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city, and get this, also a murderer. Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him." And so a third time he said to them, "Why? Why would you have me crucify this man who's innocent? What evil has he done?" Pilate asked. "I have found no guilt in him deserving of death." But Luke says, but they were urgent. demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified. And hear this, and their voices prevailed. Pilate feared man more than he feared God. So Pilate released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. And so at that moment, Jesus was taken and he was crucified. So in that particular moment, right after all that had happened, Pilate takes Jesus and he orders that he would be crucified. Now, in the first century, crucifixion was the most shameful way to die. In fact, it was reserved for the lowest of lows. We're talking slaves, rebels, foreigners, and violent, and I'm talking violent. The most violent criminals were the only ones who were ever crucified in the first century. And because of their view of the crucifixion, Roman citizens were almost never crucified because they saw it to be so shameful, so disgraceful. So even the lowest of the lows of Roman citizens were not crucified because of how brutal and awful that it was. I mean, when you're talking about being crucified, you're talking about public humiliation, you're talking about torture, and it was a deterrent for anybody who had gone against Rome. Now, to the Jews in the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is what they followed to the letter of the law, in the first 5 books, there's nothing that says anything about crucifixion. But it does say that being hanged on a tree was a sign of being cursed by God. So, on the cross, Jesus experiences the most humiliating and painful death thought humanly possible at this point. To the Jews, it was a sign not only of public humiliation, but also as one who was cursed by God. So here Jesus is hanging on this cross, publicly humiliated, tortured, incredibly painful experience, and yet at the same time, hanging on a cross is a sign as one who has been cursed by God. Now, something interesting that I think we should talk about, because this I think is really important to the story. So while the Jews found him guilty of these crimes, the evidence suggests otherwise. We know from Matthew 26 that the Jews had no evidence that Jesus did the things that they said he did. And most who heard the case ruled in favor of his innocence. In chapter 23, in the book of Luke, there are 3 groups of people who actually ruled Jesus innocent, right? You've already heard Pilate and Herod. They've both said, hey, we find no guilt in this man. But there's also other folks who weigh into some evidence, go, man, I think this guy's innocent. In chapter 23, verse 39 of Luke, Jesus is hanging between the 2 criminals. You know this story. Jesus is in the middle, and there's 2 criminals on each side. And here's kind of a dialogue that happens between the 2 criminals. One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Well, then why don't you pull yourself down off the cross, and why don't you get us off this cross too?" But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds." But notice this, "But this man has done nothing wrong." We're guilty, he's done nothing wrong. Shortly thereafter, verse 44 says that it was now dark, about the 6th hour, and darkness had filled the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light had failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Matthew, if you look at Matthew's record of this particular moment, he says that the earth shook, thunder grasped, many miracles began to happen all throughout the land as Jesus breathed his last on the cross. And so in this particular moment, Luke writes, "Now when the centurion," so this is one of the soldiers who took part in hanging Jesus on the cross. "So when the centurion and those who were standing with him saw what had taken place, he praised God." Notice this. So he takes part in putting Jesus on the cross. after Jesus had breathed his last, he experienced the craziness of the moment. He praises God, and he says these words, "Certainly this man was innocent." And all of the crowds that had assembled for the spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, they returned home beating their breasts. The people who were gathered around that cross, who showed up for the spectacle, how sick is that? They showed up for the cross as a form of entertainment. Left beating their breast. Why were they beating their breast? Because they recognized that the one that they showed up for entertainment to see hung on a cross truly was the innocent Son of God. So they go home beating their breast, upset, repentant of what that they had experienced. And so this morning, if Jesus really was innocent, which I think all the evidence suggests that Jesus was innocent, why in the world would God allow, by the way, God, the good, just judge, right? Why would he allow his innocent son to go through all of that? Why would he be allowed to be wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death for crimes that he did not commit? Question mark. Well, Paul answers that question in 2 Corinthians 5:21. By the way, this might be the most important Bible verse in all of the Bible. Paul answers this question. For our sake, God made Jesus to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. John chapter 11. The Jews put to mind that they were going to do all that they could to put to death. And here's the crazy thing. They think they're doing God a favor. And yet God is using them and their wickedness to accomplish his divine will to bring about a salvation to the world. They think they're doing God a favor. And yet on this Passover Eve, God used their wickedness as a tool to sacrifice the final and the perfect Passover lamb. Oh, the irony. So when sinful humanity deserved death, God sacrifices his perfect son. Notice what Paul says. For our sake, God made him. Who's doing the action there? Is it the religious leaders of the day? No. The one who's doing the action is not them. It is God himself. It is God who puts his son, who sentences his son to death. His innocent son to death, so that all who would receive him as their substitute, they might become the righteousness of God, meaning you are forgiven, meaning you are made right before God, meaning now for those who have said yes to him, stand in the righteousness of God. That means that God no longer looks at those as sinners, but as children covered in the blood of Jesus. Remember, what is the Passover lamb? The Passover lamb was an act of faith by the people of Israel to sacrifice a lamb, to put the blood over their doorpost, so that on that particular night when the angel of death flew over, those who were covered under the blood would not experience death, but would experience life. In the same way, this is the final lamb who was sacrificed, who all who receive him as their sin substitute would experience the covering of the blood so that you would not experience death. Innocence was exchanged for guilt so that the guilty might experience innocence. Guilt was exchanged so that you and I, this is the great exchange, right? So that you and I might go free from our sin and shame and guilt, never to return. Never to return. The promise of the cross is this beautiful promise of God's faithfulness to kill innocence so that the guilty who deserved death would never experience death, but would experience everlasting life for all of eternity. But even more so, friendship with the God in whom they were created to walk with, to dine with, to live with. Wow. That's pretty incredible. So, during my time in this court experience, I'm sitting there, I'm listening to the defendant and the prosecutor work through, their speeches. And one of the things that I noticed about the defendant is that he mentioned that at one time he was a prosecutor. And I thought, wow, how in the world does a guy go from putting people like this guy in prison to now defending this guy, who, by the way, was a really bad guy, who did some really bad things. And he was actually criminally charged and sentenced because of the bad things that he did. And I thought, how in the world does this guy represent this guy who is clearly a really, really bad guy? And what makes him go from being a prosecutor to a defense attorney? Well, I'm the weird one who looks things up, right? So I go home and I'm Googling this guy, and I realize, whoa, I think I might know. Now, this is purely assumption, but here's what I found out. This guy, a handful of years ago, was a prosecutor who set and prosecuted a young man who was charged and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Okay, this is a young man, he was a high school student. Brutal, ruined his life, right? Well, a couple years later, they find out that he was wrongfully convicted of something that he didn't do. I don't know. Maybe that guy is a defense attorney because he experienced prosecuting somebody who was innocent and put them in prison for something that they didn't do. I don't know. The point here is this: his life was changed. So was that young man's life was changed. And so was everybody in that room who experienced that. This morning, we're experiencing a similar thing. Here we are in this room. We're being reminded, for most of us, we're being reminded, maybe some of you, you're hearing this for the very first time. There was a man 2,000 years ago who stood before a jury and who was sentenced to something that he did not do so that those who were guilty could go free. You can't sit in that room and not be changed. You can't sit in that room and you know that that's true and not walk out of this room changed. So whether that's a reminder, man, you ought to be reminded as you think about the cross this week, wow, that cross is a symbol of God's faithfulness to save me, to redeem me, and to transform my life. And so it's a reminder every day to choose life, to choose to not go back to that grave, but to live in the freedom that has been purchased for you. If you're in the room and maybe you're indifferent, or maybe it's Easter season and somebody's drug you here, or whatever that may be, or maybe you just don't believe all this stuff at all, but you're here. By the way, it's not a coincidence that you're here. Listen, you need to know that this is true. Very few, if any, people argue against all of these things that we just talked about this morning. Even unbelievers don't argue this stuff. 2,000 years, we're still talking about it. Why? Because it happened. And you need to reconcile that. You need to work through that. What does that mean? If this man was really killed, the question that you've got to work through is, this guy it's either true or he's crazy and we're all crazy, but I'm going to bet with crazy. If you want to talk about it, I'd love to talk with you more about it. But the point is that we need to walk out of the room changed. The cross is the great equalizer where we all stand before the cross. No matter who we are, no matter what we've done, no matter what we have or what we don't have, we all stand before the cross the same, guilty. It's just a matter of how we walk away from that cross. We either continue in our guilt or we continue in innocence because of what he's done for us. Let's pray. God, thank you for Jesus. Lord, I'm thankful that he faithfully hung on that cross for me. Lord, at any given moment, he could have jumped right off of that cross. He could have put an end to all of it, and yet he did not, Lord. Thank you. Thank you that he submitted himself to you and to your plan and to your will. And by his death, I am alive. Lord, thank you that he did what only he could do, only the perfect, sinless Lamb could do, purchasing our freedom and our forgiveness. It's in the name of Jesus that we pray. Amen.